In a 2014 interview, George R. R. Martin raised several questions about Tolkien's depiction of governance within The Lord of the Rings. Among other things, Martin asked what Aragorn's tax policy was, or whether Aragorn kept a standing army. Now, the tax question is the one everybody repeats, usually with a laugh, and that's how a serious charge ends up remembered as a joke. As a historian, however, I've spent years studying how real crowns paid their soldiers and pulled in their revenue, and those two questions often were the ones a king lived or died on. But despite their validity, these two questions are only the top of Martin's list. So in order to settle if either Martin or Tolkien were wrong, we need to dig deeper. So let me start with the rest of the quote, because the questions nobody repeats are heavier than the one everybody does. After the tax policy and the standing army, Martin asked what Aragorn did in times of flood and famine. And then, in the same breath, he asked whether Aragorn pursued what he called a policy of systematic genocide against the orcs. That fourth question shows the complaint was never just about bookkeeping. Nobody who has ever posted the tax policy line under a video was thinking about orc genocide. And yet there it sits, 3 questions later, in the same answer. That tells you what Martin was actually reaching for. The thing underneath all 4 of Martin's questions is what power did in that world once the fighting stopped. And the accusation is that Tolkien spends 3 volumes on the fight and then falls silent the moment somebody has to govern. And that is a much harder thing to answer than the meme version of it. It gets harder still when you notice that Martin is not the only serious person making it. China Miéville, another fantasy novelist, has said the same thing about Tolkien in his own words, and he says it outright as nothing but criticism. He calls Tolkien's outlook resolutely rural, petty bourgeois, conservative, anti-modernist. Let me unpack that a little, because those are 4 heavy words doing 4 different jobs. Rural means the good life in these books is always the countryside. And the countryside is always the thing that has to be protected. Petty bourgeois means the moral center of the story is small property and small comfort. A hole in the ground with a well-stocked pantry and a garden gate. Conservative means the ideal outcome is restoration, putting back what was there before rather than building something that never existed. And anti-modernist means that the machinery of the modern world, the mills and the furnaces and the industry, arrives in the story almost exclusively as the thing evil builds when it takes over a place. And he is right about all 4. You can agree with every word of that and still love the books, and I do on both counts. But watch what happens when you set Miéville's description next to Martin's question, because the 2 of them turn out to be making one argument from opposite ends. Miéville is describing a world where the right order of things is treated as a moral fact. Good land, good people, the rightful king back on his throne, and the story takes that arrangement to be the way things are supposed to be. Martin is pointing at what that arrangement lets a writer skip. If the right man on the throne is already the answer, then nobody in the book ever has to set a toll, move a grain shipment, or decide which province goes hungry this winter. You can see exactly what both of them mean by looking at what the book does the moment Aragorn takes the throne. In Middle-earth, a good king is not just easier to live under. His goodness changes what happens to the country itself. He returns, and the White Tree of Gondor, dead for generations, is replaced by a living sapling he finds on the mountain above the city, and it comes into flower that same summer. The land recovers. Tolkien puts those 2 things in that order on purpose, and he means you to read the second one as a result of the first. So when nobody in the book ever sits down to work out how Gondor gets fed, that is not a gap he forgot to fill. That is his answer. Put the right man on the throne, and the country comes back to life around him. Put it that way, and the complaint stops being a cheap shot about spreadsheets. It turns into a disagreement about how the world actually works. Tolkien thought the character of the man in charge changes the fortunes of the people underneath him. Martin does not think that, which gives us something we can actually test, and it is worth being precise about what it is. Martin is not really asking for a tax rate. He is asking whether the book ever shows the job of ruling being done. A coronation is a ceremony. A family tree is a record. Neither of those is what he is after. He wants somebody with power deciding something difficult on the page in front of you, where you can watch the decision happen and disagree with the person making it. That is the whole test. And before we go looking for it, I should say how rare that thing is, because fantasy as a genre almost never does it. The stories we love are about getting the throne, deserving the throne, losing the throne, or blowing the throne up entirely. Almost none of them are about year 3 of the reign, when somebody has to set the tolls on the river road or decide whether the abbey gets the exemption it has been asking for since spring. That is not purely a fantasy problem either, because the real thing was just as undramatic. A medieval king's revenue rarely looked like a policy you could state in a sentence. Money came from farming out collection to whoever would bid for the job, from rents on royal land, from tolls and monopolies, and from taking a cut of the fines handed down in court. Later medieval crowns did build real machinery around that. An exchequer, customs duties, taxes argued out with a parliament. But ask most medieval monarchs for their tax policy, and what comes back is a long list of separate local arrangements, many of them older than the king you asked. So when Martin asks the question, he's asking for something almost no writer in the genre has ever put on a page, including the writers who care most about politics. That does not make the question unfair. It just means that if Tolkien fails this test, he is going to have a very great deal of company. And that is worth remembering when the internet uses this quote as though it isolates him. So hold on to that test. Does the book ever show somebody with power doing the job of ruling, where you can watch it happen? Both writers get measured against exactly that, and the answer is not the one I expected when I started. So how do people actually defend Tolkien against all that? Two ways mostly, and the interesting part is that one of them holds up completely, while the other is aimed at the wrong part of the book. And almost everybody reaches for the wrong one first. Start with when Aragorn actually becomes king, because almost the whole defense comes down to that timing. He is crowned near the end of the final volume, with only the journey home and the long farewells left after it, which means very nearly the entire story has already happened before he holds the throne at all. 3 volumes of walking, fighting, hiding, and deliberately not claiming what is his. And then, at the very end, he takes it. The version I get most often in my own comments puts it simply. The book is about Aragorn becoming king. It was never about Aragorn being king, so asking about the reign is asking about a stretch of time the story deliberately stops before. And that defense is completely fair. I want to say so plainly because I think the people making it keep getting talked past. If you write a story about a man becoming king, the story ends when he becomes king. Asking why it doesn't then contain 400 more pages of him being king is asking for a sequel, not identifying a flaw. So defense number 1 wins on the merits. I'd like to hand it that win and move on, because defense number 2 is where this whole argument keeps going wrong. And the second one is the appendices. If Martin had bothered to read the appendices, he would have known the answers to his questions. And I have seen that comment under my own videos more than once. For anyone who hasn't been back there, the appendices are the reference material at the end of The Return of the King. And they are genuinely one of the strangest things any novelist has ever attached to a story. You get family trees running back generations, and king lists for both Arnor and Gondor. There is a timeline of the second and third ages that covers thousands of years, and the kings of Rohan are listed in order, as are the stewards of Gondor, who governed the country for centuries with the throne standing empty because there was no king left to sit in it. Tolkien even wrote you essays on the calendars and on how the languages were written down. Nothing else in the genre comes close to it, and I would defend it against anybody. It still loses this argument though. So look at what those pages are actually for, because that is where the defense falls apart. The appendices tell you who ruled and when they ruled, which makes them a record of succession. And a record of succession is a completely different kind of document from a scene. Knowing that Denethor was the 26th ruling steward of Gondor gives you a name and a number in a sequence. It does not put you in the room while he decides something and gets it catastrophically wrong. Even the one piece of actual narrative back there, the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, is a love story rather than an account of a reign. Martin's question was what the person holding the office actually did with it, and a family tree structurally cannot answer that, no matter how magnificent the family tree happens to be. And I understand completely why people reach for it anyway, because the appendices really are the best available proof that Tolkien had thought hard about how a country runs. He knew who the vassal princes were, and he knew how each competing claim to the crown had eventually been settled or never pressed again. And he tracked an empty throne across centuries of caretaker government without once losing the thread. Anyone who has tried to keep a fictional succession straight across even 2 generations knows precisely how much work that represents, and how quickly it turns into a spreadsheet you are afraid to open. So the appendices absolutely prove he thought about governance, which is a genuine and useful thing to prove. What they cannot show is him putting any of that thinking into a scene, and a scene is what Martin asked for. So the appendices defense loses, and it loses for a reason worth naming out loud, because it is the same reason this argument has been running for over a decade without resolving. People keep answering the question they know they can win instead of the question that was actually asked, and it is costing them the argument. Which brings me to the standard I am going to settle this with, and it is a simple one. A story is judged by what it promised its reader. The measure is the contract the book itself opened with, and whether the book paid that contract off in full. What some other story would have promised has nothing to do with it, and neither does whatever you personally hoped it would turn into around chapter 9. That idea has a name, and it is the story promise, which is the middle of the 3 frameworks in my free story compass. The compass is a 5-page field guide you can get through in a single sitting. It is down in the description if you want it. And I would honestly start there if you have ever finished a draft and then struggled to say in one sentence what it was actually about. Because the moment you apply that standard evenly, both of these authors are hanging on the same hook, and the place to look for Tolkien's answer turns out to be a chapter that almost nobody in this argument ever cites. So go to that chapter. The war is over, Aragorn has just been crowned, and he is sitting in judgment in Minas Tirith. A soldier is standing in front of the new king of Gondor, and every person in that room already knows the law is against him. His name is Aragorn, and he is a guard of the citadel, the fortress at the top of the city. During the battle he abandoned his post, and then he killed inside the Hallows. That is the burial ground of Gondor's kings, where shedding blood is forbidden. He did both of those things for one reason. Denethor, the steward who had governed Gondor for years while the throne stood empty, had given up on the war and was about to burn his own living son alive on a funeral pyre. Aragorn broke the law to stop him, and the son lived. The law does not care about any of that. By the letter of it, Aragorn should die for what he did, and everybody standing in that room knows it. So watch what the king does. Not off stage, and not in a footnote, but on the page, in his own words, in front of witnesses. All penalty is remitted for your valor in battle, he says, and still more because all that you did was for the love of the Lord Faramir. Then he takes Aragorn out of the city guard entirely and posts him to Faramir in Ithilien, to serve as the guard of the man he broke the law to save. Look at what that actually is, because it is easy to read past it as a nice moment for a minor character. A head of state is weighing a capital offense against the motive behind it, and deciding in public that the motive outweighs the letter of the law. Then he says out loud why he decided that way, and reassigns the offender so that the punishment itself becomes a posting. So that is a legal judgment with the reasoning attached to it. It is mercy and legal precedent in a single ruling, handed down by the exact person Martin says we never once see governing. And it is not the only thing in that chapter, which is the part that really got me when I went back to check. Aragorn pardoned the Easterlings, the men who had fought for Sauron out of the lands to the east, who had given themselves up, and he sent them away free. The peoples of Harad, the southern kingdoms who had spent generations on the other side of that war, got a peace settlement, and then he freed the slaves of Mordor and gave them all the lands about Lake Nurnen to be their own. Nurnen is the great inland sea down in the south of Mordor, and its shores are the farmland Mordor's slaves were worked on. So read that last one twice, because it is genuinely startling. One of the first peacetime acts of the restored king is to take farmland off a defeated enemy and hand it to the people who were enslaved to work it. That is a decision about property, about who owns the ground under a defeated population, and it comes down in favor of the least powerful people in the entire book. So it is the opposite of a throwaway. And think for a moment about everything that one decision implies, because this is where the real governing is. Somebody had to determine that the freed workers of Nurnen constituted a people with a legitimate claim rather than an enemy population to be dispersed and forgotten. That ground is also the farmland of a conquered territory. It is pointedly not going to the victorious lords of Gondor who had just spent an entire war earning the right to ask for it. Now think about what that sets up. A new polity now exists inside the borders of the defeated power. That is a foreign policy problem for the next 50 years at a minimum, and somebody in that throne room accepted the trade knowingly. Tolkien writes the whole thing in a single clause and moves on. But inside that clause there is a land settlement and a recognition that these people have standing at all, and the arrangement is permanent. So that is more actual statecraft than most fantasy novels manage across 900 pages of court intrigue. And almost nobody talks about it. So inside a handful of pages you get foreign policy toward a defeated enemy, a ruling on war crimes and surrender, land reform, and a capital case decided on the grounds of motive. And every bit of that sits in the main narrative. The chapter is called The Steward and the King. It sits near the end of The Return of the King. And it is right there in the main story rather than in the back matter everyone keeps pointing at. Now, Tolkien went a little further outside the novel too. In one of his published letters, he wrote that Aragorn re-established the Great Council of Gondor and made Faramir his chief counselor. So that is a constitutional arrangement and a senior personnel decision. packed into a single sentence. That one is not in the story, and I am not going to pretend a letter carries the same weight a chapter does, but it tells you the man had thought about the machinery, which is worth knowing when the accusation on the table is that he never bothered to. And there is one more thing in this world that gets left out of the argument entirely, which surprises me every time. Gondor has a civil war in its own history called the Kinstrife, fought over who had the legitimate right to the crown. Tolkien's own summary of what that war left behind is bleak. The descendants of the kings had become few, he writes, and the kings had become jealous and watchful of those near akin. Put that in plain terms. The kings who came after spent their reigns watching their own cousins, because any cousin was a rival claim waiting to happen. That is a ruling house eating itself over the succession, written by the author who supposedly believed a good king fixes everything just by existing. The kings survive that civil war and come out of it fewer in number and far worse at the job, which is roughly what happens to every real dynasty that fights one. And after all that came the centuries of stewards, which is the part I find genuinely remarkable. For generations, the office of king sat vacant while somebody else ran the country. And the whole arrangement held together on a shared agreement to keep calling it temporary, right down to the detail that the steward never once sat in the throne itself, and he governed instead from a plain chair at the foot of it. Picture that for a second, because it is one of the sharpest images of political self-deception anywhere in the genre. You have a man with all the power of a king, running the country for his whole life, and sitting slightly lower and to the side so that nobody has to say out loud what has actually happened. So this is a world where politics visibly fails, and it fails in the specific ways politics actually fails. It fails through succession disputes, and then through a royal line so suspicious of its own relatives that it shrinks, generation by generation. Eventually, the throne stands empty for generations, while a caretaker government becomes the real one in everything but name, and everybody involved keeps pretending otherwise. And Tolkien wrote all of that down. He just never put any of it in a scene, because that was not the story he set out to tell, which is exactly where my own case runs out, because I have to be fair here too. What that closing chapter gives you is a series of governing acts delivered in the space of a few pages at the end of a very long book. So you get to see the reign for a moment. You never get to live inside it. And anyone telling you Tolkien wrote a governance novel is overselling it about as badly as Martin undersold it. If the test is a reign shown as work, kept up over years and watched from the inside, Tolkien passes it by a far thinner margin than his defenders want to admit. Which raises the question that decides this whole thing. If a handful of governing acts in a closing chapter is too thin to count as showing a reign, then we had better check whether the man who set that bar can clear it himself. So the argument is only worth having if both writers get measured the same way, with no favorites. Same test for both of them. Whatever it costs Tolkien, it is allowed to cost Martin. And to be completely fair to him, Martin passes the first part of that test easily and immediately. For a start, his series known as A Song of Ice and Fire has money in it, and not vaguely. There is a treasury, and the crown carries a real debt to a named creditor. An actual office of state exists to manage that debt, and it is held by a character the story cannot be told without. He also built the institution around it, which is more than most of the genre ever bothers with. The small council in those books is a working government. One man is in charge of the money, another is in charge of the law, and each of them has to answer for his own department. There is even an officer for the spying, which tells you most of what you need to know about that court. Meetings happen, and the seats keep getting filled with the wrong people for political reasons, because somebody is always angling for somebody else's chair. So that is a government that behaves like a government, which almost nothing else in the genre bothers to write. And none of it is accidental. The scene everybody should be quoting in this argument is Ned Stark's first real look at the crown's finances. Ned has just been handed the running of the kingdom as Hand of the King, which is the job of governing on the monarch's behalf while the monarch does other things. So he asks the man who keeps the crown's books, Littlefinger, what the throne actually owes. Ned gets his answer at the council table in front of everybody. They owe Lord Tywin some 3 million dragons at present. That is a hard number in a novel attached to a named creditor, delivered across a council table by the one man in the room whose job it is to know it. So the money is real. You cannot wave that away, and I would not want to. Martin asked whether fantasy ever shows the unglamorous side of ruling. And then he went and put it in his own books, on purpose, with the numbers left visible where readers would trip over them. Anybody who wants to argue he was a hypocrite about the mere existence of money in fantasy is going to lose that argument in about 4 seconds flat, and they should. But apply the real test to it, not the easy one. The standard was a reign shown as work, which means somebody with power deciding something difficult on the page, where you can watch it happen. So what does that scene give you? It gives you a man being told a number by an official. What Ned does in that room is receive a briefing, and the briefing exists because the plot needs him to discover that the treasury is empty and the throne is compromised. The 3 million dragons are a fact about Aragorn, and a fact about Aragorn is precisely what the appendices give you about Gondor, so it is a ledger entry with better staging around it. Picture the chapter that is actually missing here. Not the coronation and not the war council, but the ordinary business of running a country for a year, which I do not think most people arguing about this have ever sat down and imagined. It opens with bad news about the harvest. The king has 3 ways out and all 3 cost him something. He can open the grain stores, which feeds people now and throws away the favor he was holding over a border lord who wants that grain for himself. He can buy grain from a neighboring kingdom, which means borrowing more from a creditor he already owes. Or he can do nothing, let the price of bread climb, and wait to see which villages start walking toward the capital in the spring. Then he picks one, and the next chapter is about what that choice does to people. Nobody gets poisoned, nobody draws a sword. It is a man in a room deciding which part of his own country gets a hard year. That is what Aragorn shown as work looks like. But the question is, how many would want to read it? Also, if you go looking for it in Martin's books, the chapter where somebody who actually holds power sits down and does a year's governing, it is not really there either. Those books are magnificent at people trying to take the throne and at people trying to survive standing anywhere near it. But that harvest chapter and the long boring middle of an administration that actually works is as absent from Westeros as it is from Gondor. Martin built a world with far more visible machinery in it than Tolkien ever did, and then wrote brilliantly about the people fighting over the machinery, rather than the person operating it. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a gotcha, because it is the most interesting thing in the entire argument once you stop keeping score. It tells you something true about writing, rather than something petty about 2 novelists. The more machinery a story shows you, the more that story owes you. Martin put a debt on the page, so now his readers expect the crown's finances to matter, and they expect them to keep mattering for thousands of pages, across 5 books and counting. Every piece of infrastructure you make visible turns into a promise you are then obliged to keep. Tolkien made almost none of it visible, so he owed almost none of it. Martin made a great deal of it visible, and he has been paying that off ever since. So that is the real craft lesson buried under a decade of internet arguing. If you are building a world with that much machinery in it, and you want the thing to actually hold together, that is exactly what my world building system is built to do. It runs 10 modules and more than 60 lessons that take you from a blank map to a story-ready world Bible. It is out now, and it is a single payment that gets you lifetime access. Anyway, back to Martin and Tolkien, because I went into this expecting to end up somewhere in the middle, and I did not. So Martin was wrong. He was right to ask the question in the first place, and he was right about the kind of book Tolkien was writing. Where he was wrong is the one line everybody quotes him for, which is that Tolkien never shows a king doing the job. Tolkien does show it. He shows it in a single chapter at the end of the story, and that chapter contains a pardon for a soldier who broke the law, a peace settlement with an enemy nation, farmland handed to freed slaves, and a death sentence set aside because of why the man did what he did. All of it decided by the king himself in his own voice, in front of witnesses in the main story. That is a man ruling, and it is considerably more than the accusation allows for. And Martin is wrong a second time in the way that matters more, because the test he set does not spare his own books. Neither of these writers shows you a reign being run from the inside. One of them gestured at it in a few pages at the very end. The other built a treasury, staffed it, put a real number in it, and then wrote 5 books about people trying to get near it. So whatever this failure is, it belongs to almost every story that has a throne in it. A government that simply works is a government with no story in it, and a story is what all of us actually came for. So why was a tax policy the wrong thing to demand of that particular book? Because of what the Lord of the Rings told you it was going to be, right at the start. It opens on a birthday party in a village, and it closes on a ship leaving a harbor. Everything between those 2 points is about the end of an age, and about what the people who lived through it had to give up. It promised you a story about vanishing and endurance and the weight of carrying something you never asked to carry, and it paid every bit of that off. A book that promises you the end of an age does not then owe you the revenue model of the age that follows, any more than a heist film owes you the casino's quarterly filings. And this is where it stops being about 2 famous men and starts being about the thing you are working on. So name the promise your story makes out loud in one sentence, the way a reader would say it to a friend after finishing the first chapter. Then work out which machinery that promise obliges you to show. If your promise is a war for a throne, then the money is fair game and your readers will absolutely come asking about it. So you had better have an answer ready before they do. If your promise is that magic is draining out of the world and the people who still remember it are dying, then nobody is going to audit your grain yields. So you can leave the harvest alone with a completely clear conscience. Your world doesn't owe the reader everything. It owes the reader what you promised. And if you want to know where that argument actually started, it's the video sitting on screen right now. That's my historian's pass over the political mistakes fantasy writers keep making. So go and find out which one your favorite book is making.